Hey everyone, it's T-Lore with STOBetter. A common question in STO is,
what is the best phaser? What is the best weapon type?
This often comes down to choosing between several procs, and in most cases the answer is, it doesn't matter. Why is that? Let's start with a little background. What is a proc? For Star Trek Online, each energy weapon has an effect secondary to its damage, most of the time a 2.5% chance of occurring. On a standard phaser, such as a loot drop or from crafting, each weapon has a 2.5% chance to shut down a random subsystem. This proc triggers once per firing cycle, not per shot. This means that the full firing cycle rolls this chance once, regardless of weapon or firing mode. Beam overload cuts the firing cycle duration in half, which is why you often see that beam overload is better for triggering procs. You roll twice as often. Fire at will, scatter volley, rapid fire, and surgical strikes all have the same duration firing cycle even if the number of shots fired change within that cycle. Exceed rated limits and reroute reserves to weapons have the same base firing cycle but apply haste to energy weapons, allowing the firing cycle to cycle that much faster. 100% haste effectively cuts the firing cycle in half, doubling the speed at which you roll for procs. Let's take that standard proc a step further. Let's ignore haste for a bit, as this simply speeds up the rate at which you roll for procs. A 2.5% chance means that 1 in 40 firing cycles will trigger the proc. That means it will take on average 200 seconds to roll the proc once. If you outfit a cruiser with 8 of the same phaser, you are now rolling 8 times, once for each weapon, in a single firing cycle. This now means that on average you should roll the proc once every 25 seconds. The problem with this mentality is that we're assuming perfect deterministic probability. Out of 40 cycles, 39 will not trigger and 1 will trigger. In reality, there is a chance you get 2 procs back to back, but there's also a chance you go 80 or more cycles without triggering the proc. We call this independent probability. It doesn't matter what the result was previously, you still have a 2.5% chance of triggering the proc with each firing cycle. As such, we use a binomial distribution to filter out the noise a bit and get a more realistic answer. For a binomial distribution, we give it a number of n independent experiments, what we call rolls, each asking for a binary answer of yes or no. Did the proc trigger? Each of these has the proc chance of 2.5% chance of success and 97.5% chance of failure. If we assume one roll, we'll have perfect probability of 2.5% chance of success and 97.5% chance of failure. If we assume 2 rolls, we end up with 3 different outcomes: no trigger, 1 trigger, 2 triggers. The chance of failure is 97.5% times 97.5%, or 95.0625% chance, while the 2 triggers is 2.5% times 2.5%, or 0.0625% chance. This means that 1 trigger is 100% minus 0.0625% chance minus 95.0625% chance, or 4.875% chance. You can see after 2 rolls we don't have a 5% chance of triggering a proc, but just under that. As we increase the number of rolls, our probability continues to go up that we get a trigger, but it's not simply adding 2.5% every time we roll. In fact, 90% of the time, to get at least 1 proc, it would take on average 91 rolls. 99% of the time, you will get at least 1 proc in 182 rolls. If we go the other direction, after 64 rolls, we'll have at least 1 proc 80% of the time. If we assume a combat time, we know exactly how many firing cycles will occur with 8 weapons and no haste. A firing cycle takes 5 seconds, so we'll roll for a proc 144 times in 90 seconds, and 480 times in 300 seconds, which is 5 minutes. Again, assuming 8 identical weapons, here's a graph showing the percentage chance we get at least the number of procs shown along the bottom, hence why the values don't add up to 100%. You can see that in a 90-second combat, most of the time we won't get more than a couple procs. If we look at an entire 5-minute combat, we're essentially guaranteed to get at least 5 procs, and 3/4 of your runs will have at least 10 procs. However, you can see that it drops off pretty quickly once you get above 10 procs, and you will only get 15 or more in about 1/5 of your runs. If we stuck with the 1 in 40, we'd expect 12 procs in 480 cycles. In reality, we only get 12 procs half the time, and 8 procs 80% of the time. If we check with 64 rolls to get 1 proc 80% of the time, it lines up with getting around 8 procs in 5 minutes 80% of the time. With the heavy math out of the way, let's stick to 60 rolls to trigger a proc instead of the common knowledge of 40 rolls to trigger a proc. And that'll get you there 80% of the time. Also, more than likely, you aren't going to have all 8 weapons with the same proc, either due to set pieces, adding a token torpedo, or simply not having 8 weapon slots. Let's now assume you have 6 energy weapons with the same proc, and we'll assume the 60 rolls to trigger the proc. This means it takes on average 50 seconds to trigger the proc once. In a 5-minute patrol, that means you'll likely see the proc trigger 5 or 6 times. You can't control when it will trigger, so let's not even talk about it triggering a plasma damage over time proc on a ship right before it dies. Let's compare 6 triggers of a proc to how many times your weapons fire in that same 5 minutes. 6 weapons with a 5-second cycle means 72 cycles per minute. Without a firing mode, 4 shots per cycle for a total of 1,440 shots fired in 5 minutes from just those 6 weapons. This means that for 1,440 shots fired, we only trigger 6 procs. 0.4% of your shots. Wow, to me that's staggeringly low to be chasing procs for. Now you know why we don't chase procs. It has such a low impact on your overall damage output. Even adding haste won't fix this. You'll get more procs, but also more shots overall.
But Mr. Taylor, what about procs with a duration? Doesn't the duration make them cover more shots?
Remember how you can't control when procs happen? Many procs apply to your target. Even at the highest levels, just about every target in the game won't survive the 15 seconds or longer some procs last for. And that's assuming you don't trigger your procs 2 seconds before the target dies. You also aren't going to trigger it on multiple targets, such as with Fire at Will or Cannon Scatter Volley. This is why procs that apply to your target are really at the bottom of the list. Standard Phaser, Polaron, Plasma, Tetrion, and Disruptor all apply to your target, so have the added disadvantage of fizzling even if they do trigger before you can take advantage of the full effect. However, there are procs that apply to your ship and allow you to take advantage of the full duration on all of your weapons, such as Herald anti-proton weapons. If we use the example of Herald anti-proton, which has a duration of 20 seconds, then in theory we could have 7% bonus energy damage for 2 minutes of our 5-minute patrol. If we average that out, that's 2.8% bonus energy damage for slotting 6 Herald anti-proton weapons, or an average of around 0.5% bonus energy damage per weapon. You're chasing a proc for literally half a percentage point. Even good procs are really low impact. Here's the catch. Not every proc is 2.5% chance. There are several that are a 5% chance of triggering, or many of the set pieces have special conditions rather than percentage chance. Terran Task Force Beam Array is the best example of this. In addition to its weak 2.5% proc of withering radiation, it also has a scaling damage output based on the hull percentage of the target, doubling its damage on targets at 25% or less. This is a massive damage output increase and applies to every shot. The advanced piezo weapons from the Lucari reputation have a 5% AoE healing proc, which is good to begin with, but also trigger an extra damage blast on the use of Beam Overload, Cannon Rapid Fire, or Surgical Strikes, again a proc you can control. Anti-proton weapons have plus 20% crit D, which works similar to a proc as a default crit H is 2.5%. However, increasing your crit H increases your chances for the increased damage. That's simply how critical damage works. You also can get the benefit of this on every shot that crits, not just the first in the firing cycle. The Pavan Omni Beam from an event reward is a 33% chance of triggering, which is huge in itself, but it also triggers in an AoE and rolls its proc every shot. That means that even without a firing mode, its proc triggers 50 times as often as a default proc. A perfect example of 2 very similar procs is the hyper-refracting Tetrion or anti-proton dual beam bank and the Baul anti-proton weapons. Both of them bounce a portion of their damage to nearby targets. So why is one often recommended and the other not worth slotting? Hyper-refracting only bounce once per firing cycle, while the Baul weapons bounce with every shot. This is even bigger when you need the 3-piece set to bounce under Fire at Will for the hyper-refracting weapon, but can add the proc to any anti-proton weapons with a 2-piece Baul low-buy set. Both the cycle versus shot distinction and the scaling value of the bounced damage sets these two weapons apart from each other, even though they read similarly. So what does this mean for your build? Ideally, when choosing weapons, you want to start by matching flavor. The old adage still applies. Slotting 6 plasma weapons of various types will always outparse a mixed build of phaser and disruptor, for example. You can use plus plasma sources instead of the weaker plus beams or plus cannons sources. Within a specific energy type, even slotting the default weapons will be fine. If you want an extra edge, look for procs that go above and beyond the 2.5% chance, or rely on another trigger. You can also look for set pieces that will give you a bonus just for slotting the weapon. There are over 120 different weapon flavors, with many having standard procs. More than half have the 2.5% proc. From there, often the set bonuses from weapons far outpace the procs the weapons have. Once popular sensor-linked weapons each have 5 weapon amplification, which equates to 2% weapon critical damage. Compare that to slotting the advanced inhibiting weapons, which even aside from the minus damage resistance rating proc, which just about always triggers, you get a 10% Cat 1 phaser damage when used with the Universal Console. In many cases, the 10% Cat 1 will outpace 2% crit D on an energy weapons build. Also note that T6 reputations grant 2% bonus damage to reputation weapons. As of this video's release, in no particular order, the best phasers are a full set of 6 advanced phasers, if you can afford them. The Terran Task Force phaser is best in slot for phasers due to its scaling damage. The phaser wide-angle dual heavy beam bank is great unless using exceed rated limits or reroute reserves to weapons, as that haste doesn't apply to wide-angle dual beam bank. Radiolytic phasers are great filler as there is no slot limit. Advanced inhibiting phasers are good rear weapons due to debuff and set potential. Some builds even use both. The best disruptors are a full set of 6 advanced disruptors, if you can afford them. The Terran Task Force Disruptor is best in slot for disruptors due to its scaling damage. The Disruptor wide-angle dual heavy beam bank is great unless using exceed rated limits or reroute reserves to weapons, as that haste doesn't apply to the wide-angle dual beam bank. Spiral wave disruptors are good due to built-in extra mods. Resonating Disruptor is used as a filler on support builds, but is a 2.5% proc. The best plasma weapons are the advanced isolytic dual beam bank. The single cannon isn't worth the base damage loss. The advanced piezo plasma is good for both the 2-piece set as well as technical overload if using beam overload, cannon rapid fire, or surgical strikes. The ultimate modified omni gives crit hit to everything and always procs on crit, not to mention the strong 3-piece set potential. The experimental Romulan plasma beam is good if using a firing mode that doesn't ignore weapon drains. Polaron weapons are generally pretty weak. The advanced piezo Polaron is good for both the 2-piece set as well as technical overload if using beam overload, cannon rapid fire, or surgical strikes. Advanced inhibiting Polaron weapons are good rear weapons due to debuff and set potential. Some builds even use both. Don't forget the morphogenic set often slotted for the strong 3-piece set, even though the weapon itself is pretty weak. Anti-proton weapons by default are the best in their weapon type, with 20% crit D as the default passive. Baul weapons also dominate anti-proton weapons as a strong extra damage source, and with a 2-piece linked sentry set applying the Baul proc to all anti-proton weapons, you can be more flexible with mix and match with anti-proton. If you can afford it and have the torpedo already, the overcharged Delphic dual beam bank is a good option due to the 2-piece set. Don't use with beam overload. It doesn't build stacks during the beam overload. Tetrion weapons are the weakest of the available weapon types, with the best weapon still relying on a proc and coming from an event that isn't even running. The interlacing Tetrion set is the strongest for Tetrion, but often just the core is used on other builds. Diffusive and Advanced Diffusive are the best Tetrion weapons, but are simply the best proc and so not significantly superior to any other Tetrion weapons. Finally, there are a couple of non-standard weapons. The Breen Omni, which does cold damage, and at the time is not worth ever using. The Kinetic Cutting Beam was once popular, but is never worth using now, as no firing modes enhance it. The Pavan Proton Omni, which is a 33% proc per shot in AoE that shows really strong on multi-target builds, but actually less so on beam overload builds due to its per shot nature. An honorable mention is the Heavy Biomolecular Turret, and it is good if you can pair it with the torpedo or a console for the set bonus, and it comes in 4 of the 6 weapon flavors. Hopefully this helped you to understand the differences between all the different procs in Star Trek Online and what to look for as new procs come out or as you're looking through your weapons to see which ones you might want to slot. In the end, most of the time, if it's a 2.5% proc, it's not something you're going to need to worry about. And you'll get more benefit out of slotting all the same weapon type than trying to chase these small procs that you can get. If this video helped you, consider liking and sharing this video, or subscribe to our channel. For more guides and builds, check us out at www.stobetter.com.
Pew pew!